So, here we are. Fake news and Donald Trump's battle with the news media are actually nothing new. It's a battle that's been going on ever since the invention of the printing press, and the one who started it was Henry VIII. The press called him a horrible monster, and guess what? He accused the pamphleteers of putting out false fables. False fables. In other words, fake news just by another name. So Donald Trump can claim to have invented the phrase false fake news, but actually the idea's been around a long while. Now, it's often said that the pen is mightier than the sword. Well, I've got a shock for you. That's wrong. If you write a letter to a friend complaining about the government, the friend reads it and puts it away in a drawer, that's the end of it. But actually, if you then print that letter thousands or maybe millions of times and distribute it, you can actually stir up discontent or even rebellion. So the old adage really should say, the press is mightier than the sword. It's technology that really makes the difference. And we've added, since the days of the printing press, TV, radio, and in our own age, of course, mass communication with the internet. Mass communication is something that can usurp a government's power to tell people what to think. And that's why totalitarian governments imprison reporters and editors and control the media. Those in positions of power on the one side and journalists on the other are in fact natural enemies, and they always have been. And that's what this book is all about. But it's about much more than that, because the news media, of course, is only as good or as bad as the people who write for it and control it. So this book really is about people, the heroes and the villains. Now, I'm very pleased to say that we have one of the present-day heroes with us this evening. He's 3 times been acclaimed Journalist of the Year, and only last month he was awarded the Charles Wheeler Prize for his contribution to broadcast journalism. And he's the political correspondent for Channel 4 News, and he's Michael Crick. Michael, please give Michael a good round of applause. So, Michael, it's a bit of a hell of a week for political correspondence. Yeah?
Not really. Yeah, it has, and I'm on jury service at the same time.
I know, yeah. And 2 reports.
I'm on my second trial already, and I've had three pieces on Channel 4 News, but not tonight. So, congratulations, Ed. This is a wonderful book. I mean, the cover, the title is fabulous for a start. And then the cover, the sort of Trump-looking Henry VIII. Brilliant. And inside, it really, zips along from Henry VIII to the modern day to Trump. And it's not just about the struggle between... it actually dips into most of the key episodes in British history. And it's not just about the struggle between the people in power and the media, but also about the failings of many in the media as well. I mean, it's not all one way. I mean, William Russell, the great journalistic hero of the Crimea, started off by glorifying the charge of the Light Brigade, although he quickly changed his tune. And indeed, journalists behaved abysmally during the First World War in covering up many of the horrors of the war. Although it has to be said, in one case, I didn't know this, there was one journalist who was actually, that Kitchener actually said if he returned to the Western Front, he would take him out and shoot him, which is a nice little tale that I wasn't aware of. But the great thing about this book also is that you do get to grips with that question that people always ask me: what do we do about fake news? And I always say, well, one thing, we should berate and admonish the politicians whenever they use the word fake news to mean a reporter who's got his facts wrong. Fake news isn't that. We all get our facts wrong from time to time. Fake news is deliberately putting false information into the public domain for the purposes of political or financial gain, and that's what we've got to admonish them whenever they try and make out that fake news is just sloppy journalism or journalism where you've made an honest mistake. We've got to make that distinction, because if we allow those two things to get blurred, we really are in trouble. But the great thing about this book is that you also make a number of suggestions about how we need to be more vigilant with accuracy and getting our facts right. And I've long felt that we need to do a lot more about correcting our facts and being willing to admit that we've made mistakes. I think we've also, as you say in the book, although I wouldn't go as far as you in sort of having lessons in this, but I do think we need to do more to improve the culture whereby people really appreciate what are good sources, what are reliable outlets, such as respectable newspapers and Channel 4 News, or maybe even the BBC, and the less reliable ones, the crap on some of the crap on the internet, and so on. But I think this is a wonderful book, Derek, and you were a great reporter, and I'm glad to see you've now become a great historian, and I hope this book does exceedingly well. I'm sure it will, and you've even got lots of interesting pictures and illustrations in it. So congratulations, and your writing style is as great as ever, and it's you will not put this book down. It is a fabulous book. Congratulations, and let's all toast you, if that's what we're supposed to do next. This is what I've decided, if that's what we are supposed to do. So to Derek and to Fayke Newes, or not to Fayke Newes, depending on your
I must, that's very kind, very much. Tell you one wonderful story about Michael and I working together. And if you remember this, in the build-up to the Falklands War, so we're going back rather a long way, but Michael and I were working in Rome together, because nobody knew at this time, in fact, whether Pope John Paul II was going to come out, which side he was going to come out. Would he come out for the Brits? Would he come out for the Argentines? Mike, every day, would go out with a film crew and with a microphone, something he's renowned for now. No politician ever gets away with telling Mike Crick that they're not going to do an interview. He pursues them relentlessly. And Mike would station himself in St. Mark's Square and approach every ageing cardinal that came across the square and interview them to try and find out what was happening. Now, this was something of an inspiration to me, and I thought, well, I'm going to do the same. If Mike's going to do it, I'm going to go for the big one. So Thursday morning, there is a mass in St. Peter's Square in which the Pope, before the mass, tours the whole of the square in the Pope-mobile. So I stationed myself with the film crew next to a woman who was holding her baby out, because it was well known the Pope always stopped where there was a baby. And sure enough, in fact, he did. He got down from the Pope-mobile and he came out. And I thought, this is it, I'm going to do a Mike Crick. And I dodged underneath, and I managed to get 6 words out. I pushed the microphone under the Pope's face and said, "Your Holiness, could you tell me?" And at which point a great arm came across me, strangled me and threw me to the ground, and 2 huge great guys were there in their suits. They were the papal bodyguards. And I did get a quote actually out of the Pope as a result. He said, "Bless you, my son."
Well, there was a great rivalry in ITN at that. I was only the most junior, not even called a producer, scriptwriter really. And when the Pope came to Britain, when was it? The summer of 80. Just after the Falklands, wasn't it? The summer of 82.
Yeah.
And there was a great rivalry amongst us to see who could doorstep the Pope every day. And it was so much easier to get access at that stage. And I remember I was in Canterbury working as, deputy assistant to Jeremy Thompson. And I said, "Look, Jeremy, I reckon if you stand right here, the Pope's going to come along here, turn the corner, go around there, and that's your moment." And Jeremy said, "Oh, no, you don't know what you're talking about. I've been in this business a long time." And so he went down the path and stood somewhere else. And and I thought, well, I'll stay on that corner. And sure enough, the Pope comes along, and I say, "Pope John Paul, how important has today been for you?" Actually, a rather longer question than you should ask, but anyway. And he said, very important, very important. And I was, absolutely ecstatic. And all of this was on camera. Well, it was visually on camera. The problem was the sound wasn't recorded. So there I was going around saying, "I got an interview with the Pope." Slight exaggeration. And, so that was my big break. But you managed it, so well done.
6 words anyway.
I remember at the same time, it's all coming back now, when we were doing that thing in St. Peter's Square, I can't remember the name. He was a very famous. My knowledge of cardinals was zero, and there was this very elderly cardinal who was the dean, I think, the top one. The one who brings the conclave together.
I'll play the cardinal.
Right. You remember this?
Go on then. You approached him.
Cardinal, yeah, that's right. And I thought,
to kiss the ring.
well, I'm an atheist. I can't possibly kiss his ring. So I then shook him like
Yeah, this is a famous story. The way that I heard it was that you didn't realise you had to kiss the ring. Actually,
I didn't realise. No, I didn't know what to do. I mean,
Wonderful. Okay, it's extraordinary to think that in the late 18th century, governments were so terrified of the job that Michael does now that even reporting the proceedings of Parliament was actually illegal. And that was changed largely through the efforts of one man's fight. And his name was John Wilkes. And I'm going to read you a very brief bit of the book introducing this very bizarre character. John Wilkes, politician, journalist, radical campaigner and rake, was said to be the ugliest man in England. According to a contemporary account, he was cross-eyed and had a protruding jaw. A sketch by the cartoonist Hogarth showed him with a malicious grin fit to terrify any small child. And there it is in the book. Wilkes, however, made fun of his own diabolical appearance, which he more than made up for with a fast wit and a renowned charm. He used to boast that it took him only half an hour to talk away his face. On one election campaign, a constituent told him he'd rather vote for the devil. Wilkes replied, naturally. And if your friend decides not to stand, can I count on your help? Remarkably, given his looks, he was also a big hit with the opposite sex. He claimed that his bent features gave him an advantage in any sexual conquest, declaring he could get a month's start on his rival on account of his face. Even by the permissive standards of the 18th century, Wilkes was a libertine. When John Montague, the 4th Earl of Sandwich, told him, "Sir, I do not know whether you will die on the gallows or of the pox," Wilkes replied, "That depends, my lord, on whether I embrace your lordship's principles or your mistress." Now, Wilkes was an astonishing character. He was elected to Parliament several times, thrown out of Parliament several times. He founded, published and edited a newspaper, the North Briton. He was thrown into the Tower for sedition. He spent 2 years in prison, eventually became an alderman of the City of London. And he wrote, "The liberty of the press is the birthright of a Briton, and is justly esteemed the firmest bulwark of the liberties of this country. It has been the terror of all bad ministers." So Wilkes was, once he was elected to Parliament, he got determined to fight and to fight in a way that would force the government to cave in and to agree that reporters could observe and report what the people's elected representatives were discussing in the House of Commons. And that's what he achieved. So as Michael said, there have been heroes and villains in this. Some of the heroes are very famous, like Bernstein and Woodward of the Washington Post, who forced Richard Nixon out of office when they revealed the scandal of Watergate. There are others, in fact, who are less famous you may not have heard of. For instance, Natalia Gorbanevskaya, who was thrown into prison under Khrushchev for publishing an underground newspaper. There was a man called Geoffrey Cox, known to some of us here who worked for ITN, but maybe not to others. Pioneering early editor of ITN. And he was the one who established the principle that TV news could do much more and must do much more than simply holding out a microphone and politely asking a politician to say something nice to the camera. He established the principle that it was the job of a TV reporter to challenge politicians. And then there were the suffragettes. The suffragettes discovered that they were ganged up on, not only by the government, but by almost the whole of the press, who ridiculed them and undermined their movement. And the suffragettes responded by starting their own newspaper. And they sold it themselves on the streets of the great cities and sold tens of thousands of them a week. Their motto was "truth for a penny." So, what about the villains? As Michael said, in fact, there have been reporters and editors who ducked telling the truth. And I'm just going to read you a very brief piece about the First World War, which I think really was probably the very lowest point of having reporters who ducked telling the truth and who deliberately lied. The stage was set for the First World War's most notorious cover-up conspiracy between the press on the one side and the government and the generals on the other. The Battle of the Somme. It began on the 1st of July 1916 and would last for 4.5 months. 3 million men fought and 1 million were wounded or killed. On the first day alone, and this always shocks me, 19,240 British soldiers were killed one day, and another 38,000 were wounded. During the opening hours of the fighting, the newspaper correspondents stayed in their quarters, as instructed by the Chief of Intelligence. Regular updates, carefully vetted of course, were delivered to them on the progress of the fighting. This is what newspaper readers back in the UK were told. In the Daily Chronicle, "It is on balance a good day for England and France. It is a day of promise in this war." The Manchester Guardian reproduced the Press Association's report under the headline, "Our casualties not heavy." The first day of the offensive is therefore very satisfactory. It is no longer a question here of attempts to pierce as with a knife. It is rather a slow, continuous and methodical push, sparing in lives. This was all rehashed official communiques. But when over the next weeks the correspondents were allowed out to see the fighting for themselves, they kept up the pretense, even though by now they could see that many tens of thousands of men were being killed or wounded. And the terrible thing is that these correspondents knew at the time that they were doing wrong. I just want to read you, in fact, what Beach Thomas of the Daily Mirror, who wrote 7 years after the war. "A great part of the information supplied to us by the British Army intelligence was utterly wrong and misleading. The dispatches were largely untrue so far as they deal with concrete results. For myself, on the next day, and yet more on the day after that, I was thoroughly and deeply ashamed of what I had written, for the very good reason that it was untrue." Would lives have been saved if the truth had been known? Well, we shall never know. So where are we today? We've got another revolution on our hands, there's no doubt, with the arrival of the internet, with social media, as big a revolution since the days of the invention of the printing press. But it used to be that you needed to be rich enough to own a line of printing presses or a TV or radio station in order to tell millions of people what was going on or what you claimed was going on. At least then we knew who we were dealing with. But the internet's changed all that. Now social media has put mass communication in the hands of anyone with a smartphone. Any crank, any liar, any foreign editor, even the President of the United States. And then what starts to happen is that soon people believe that the Pope did indeed endorse Donald Trump's bid to be president, or that Hillary Clinton is a paedophile. And when fake news triumphs, it's easy for those in power to blacken the name of reputable newspapers or TV news organisations. We, the rest of us ordinary citizens, end up not knowing what or who to believe. So what's to be done? There's been a lot of talk about regulating the big tech companies, Twitter, Facebook, YouTube and the rest. And those companies themselves are trying to persuade us that they're doing more to curb the lies. But you know what? The internet is so vast and is so uncontrollable that fake news is not going to go away. So we need to do something. I believe that we need to defend ourselves, just as we would do against any contagion. And to make a start, I believe that we should educate the next generation to recognise the difference between reliable fact and fake news. And in the book I go into a little bit of detail about what I think should be in those courses that we teach our children. It's time we recognised, in fact, that particularly the younger generation get most of their news from social media. That makes it very, very vulnerable. If we don't do that, I believe we're in grave danger. When we, the ordinary citizens, don't know what to believe about our political leaders, don't know the truth anymore, then we're at the top of a greasy slide. And it's a slide that can slither us down into dictatorship and the suppression of that fundamental liberty that John Wilkes identified and fought for 250 years ago. Thank you. I hope you enjoyed the book.